Hey, my name's Chris, and I'm going to talk to you today about the confronting Spirit of God. In the last couple videos, we've been just following this trajectory of the Spirit of God and how the Spirit of God helps us engage in the work of racial justice in the world. And so now we've got ourselves in a place where we're going to look at something from Acts 11 and Galatians 2. So what's just happened is that Peter is a Jewish Christian, and he's met these Gentile Christians, and he went into their home and they reconciled to this one humanity. The Spirit came for all of them. And so Peter has to leave this house, this Gentile's house, his name's Cornelius, and head back to his town where all of the Jewish Christians are located. And so he finally gets back all the way to Jerusalem where that happens, and he sits down because kind of word's getting around, and he tells the Jewish believers what happened. And all of a sudden they freak out on him because he crossed this boundary and interacted with these people that they had deemed outside or other. And they get at him and they say, in Acts 11:3, they say, "You entered the home of Gentiles and even ate with them," they exclaimed. Like they were livid. They confront Peter about how that could happen. And so Peter has to retell the story, which you can hear in the last video. And at the end of that, something shifts in them and they say, "Oh man, only God could do that." And they celebrate and they worship God. And they're like, all right, we're in on this one humanity that God has intended for all of us, that we need each other. Well, what's crazy is, so after all that happens with Peter and the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians, they come together and they start to become this one humanity, this new people that God is bringing together. So you fast forward a couple of years and you've got this guy named the Apostle Paul. It's pretty famous. You probably read about him if you're reading in the Bible at all. And in the book of Galatians, he has this encounter with Peter. And this is where the confronting spirit comes in to play. They're all eating together, right? Because this is central to the way of being Christians, is that you figure out how to share meals with one another. You humanize one another around the table. And so they're sitting there and they hang out, and then some people come to town who are Jewish believers. And Peter starts to act differently, and he neglects eating with the Gentile believers. They separate. What God intended to bring together, they separate. And Paul stands up and confronts Peter to his face, because what happens is the moment that Peter begins to abandon what God intended to bring people together out of his own experience, no less, others start to follow Peter. And they start to other the Gentile Christians and say, you actually aren't good enough. You don't measure up. You are on the outside. You don't do things like you need to do to become like us. Which is a deep challenge in the work of racial reconciliation, where essentially we say to people if you're a person of color, you need to assimilate to the way we do things. That's what Paul is confronting in Peter. It's actually a new way of being together, to share that with one another. And so Paul stands up, the power of the confronting spirit in him, and he says, this is not how it should be. And he says it to Peter. You know what's crazy about the confronting spirit is that it'll show up in the places where you don't want it to. And then it will be hard to be one who confronts what's not God's intention from the beginning. And Paul isolates himself in that moment, and he puts it all on the line to the guy who's like the leader of the church at that moment. And he says, this is not how it can be, because the moment, Peter, you step away, other people follow you and we become separate again. That's not what God's called us to do. Remember where you've come from. Remember who you are, and remember what God's already done in you through the work of the reconciling spirit. Let's confront those who stray a bit and bring them back into the fold. Bring them back into the place where we can actually sit at the table as one people again. God's intended community. But here's the challenge. Here's the challenge for you, because the confronting spirit is the hardest one. You can only confront alongside the Spirit of God if you do so in dependence on the Spirit and in humility that the Spirit will speak through you. Not to cause a scene, not to cause a ruckus, not to hurt people, but to confront what is not as God intended it to be. How do you speak on behalf of the confronting Spirit whenever you see those separating who are intended to be together?